Lawyers who read wills to families. What is the most interesting, bizarre, offensive, surprising thing you have had to read out loud? To my daughter Anne, who created my beautiful granddaughter Jane, and her dear fourth husband John, who laid hands on my Jane, I leave $1 you money-grubbing bastards. To Jane I leave all of my monetary assets, save $5,000 and my best gun which I leave to my son Bill, on the condition that he beats John bloody during the time between my funeral and my burial. Jane, bail your uncle out of jail, please. Other than names, this is the exact wording of a great uncle's will, part of it anyway. At age 9 Jane told her mother that John had molested her and her mother told her she deserved it for being a slut. So great uncle took Jane in and raised her, and his 2 kids got exactly what it says. His son also got a truck and technically a house, although he only kept it until Jane was a legal adult and could afford the tax on it. Bill got full custody of Jane when his father died and he put every penny of her money into a trust fund to mature when she was 25 because he felt like his sister would try to get the money. He was right, and in case anyone wondered, yes, Bill got his $5,000. He didn't get arrested though because John had a warrant on him so they didn't dare call the cops. Bill did kindly inform the police of his whereabouts a few weeks later. Not a lawyer, but an estate planning paralegal for many years, I've read, drafted or executed thousands of wills and trusts with clients. My first nitpicky comment is that the common belief that lawyers actually assemble the whole family and hold a reading of the will is entirely a construct of TV. You will never sit there and just read a will to people. It's mostly a bunch of legalese about bonds and payment of taxes and the powers of the executor. Only a very small portion of the will actually pertains to distributions, and in many cases it's just a paragraph stating that everything goes to the spouse if living, otherwise equally to the kids, or to the trust, which then says it all goes to spouse then kids. Believe it or not, they're usually quite mundane. When strings are attached, it's usually just parents trying to make sure their kids go to college or they get a smaller distribution, or just have to wait longer to get their money. People who don't have kids usually name about 24 beneficiaries, which is cumbersome and annoying, especially since a lot of times they don't even have much money to divide. People with kids almost always just leave the money to them equally. Probably the most faked up thing I've seen is a couple different clients who included provisions to disinherit kids and grandkids if they marry a black person. That's their prerogative, and will serve them professionally, but we tend not to get too cozy or chatty at those signings, unlike with many of the nice clients with whom we will become friendly. Just get 'em in, get 'em out in those cases. I'm late, by maybe. My father is an heir to the Procter & Gamble company. Just so we are clear, I am not rich. Anyway, my grandfather was adopted with his brother by 2 spinster sisters, part of the P&G family, had an elevator in his house, the whole 9 yards. My grandfather went to the war, was part of the Battle of the Bulge and came back completely shell-shocked. He began drinking and partying etc. When the sisters died, everything was left to his brother. Assuming my grandfather would drink away the money, my grandfather was left a small general store, to support his family, a small home and a car. He cleaned up his act and sought counseling when they figured out post-traumatic stress disorder, and his brother gave him nothing and never spoke to him after he was better. The brother once purposely crossed the street so he would not have to speak to my father, his nephew. Tons. One client left a specific gift of $10,000 to one son, and left him out of the per stripe division of the residual estate, which was sizable at the time the will be drafted. This was intended as a serious disinheritance, which he apparently talked about all the time to make the disfavored son feel bad. However, by the time he died he had a serious reversal of fortune and his estate was about $10,000, so he effectively disinherited the good children and left the black sheep everything. The bad kid appeared very poor, compared to the others, and the look of grateful surprise on the poor kid's face was almost as priceless as the shock on the others who thought they were getting rich. I heard this from another lawyer. Rich old lady leaves her entire sizable estate in a trust for the care and maintenance of her dog, as long as the dog shall live. On the dog's death, the trust paid out in full to the son. Apparently the son had Rover put down the day after the funeral and presented a demand to the trustee the very next day for the trust payout. She should have seen that one coming. My grandfather, a Vietnam War veteran, suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. It got worse in his later years and he will often isolate himself from the rest of the family, often hiding out in his bedroom when visitors were over. My grandmother would often tell us stories about how he had inherited a significant amount of money from his father way back when. She said that in their younger years he often spent his inheritance on luxurious dates and trips. After returning from war, he spent the remaining money on a house in which he and my grandmother settled and raised their children. Fast forward to his death, just a couple months back, and we found out he had written a will. Even my grandmother didn't know about it. We all had assumed he wouldn't have much to leave since most of the money he had saved from his time in the military was going towards taking care of him as he was placed in a care facility as his post-traumatic stress disorder worsened. His will told of a warehouse in Township, Michigan that holds a large collection of vintage cars. He said that the warehouse was passed down from his father, and he had all the documents to prove that he was the owner of some type of warehouse. His will estimate that the cars would be worth in excess of $2 million total. The money from his collection will be split between his 4 children. We had no idea this collection ever existed. My father and his 3 brothers had all grown up in Plano, Texas. None of us have ever been to Michigan before. Even our mother couldn't recall a time of our father ever having even gone to visit Michigan. After a long debate, my father and I, the only ones who could manage to find some time off from work, agreed to fly out to Michigan to see this collection firsthand. After a few $1,000s spent on plane tickets, hotels, we finally arrived at the warehouse my grandfather owned. It was a rundown warehouse, but it was tucked away within a compound of other warehouses that seemed to be otherwise well taken care of. Finally, coat in hand, My father punched the numbers into the keypad and the giant door began to rise. What was inside was beyond words. There was absolutely nothing. Besides a few homeless people that managed to sneak in through a hole in the corrugated metal around back, there was no car collection. We were able to contact a few owners of the neighboring warehouses, and to their knowledge no one and nothing had ever been inside of those warehouses in T. Not exactly a reading of the will story, but in the same realm. When I was like 20, my dad told me that when he died I would be getting a chunk of money, not millions but enough to do something good with. Years later he and my mom separated. He met a new woman and got married. After talking to my brother and sister, we were all worried that she would change his will or get him to change it in favor of her kids. We agreed that we didn't want money but just wanted any final wishes to be honorable. The money couldn't hurt though. Sadly then he got cancer and died 2 years ago. After he died, my siblings and I agreed to just accept however his widow divided everything. She made sure things went where he had decided. My percentage was smaller because he had added her and her children. In the 2 years since he passed she hasn't talked to us much. She calls for holidays and stuff. She tries, but she is just awkward kinda. She's also sent large sums of money on 2 occasions because she sold some land he owned. She has shown me and my siblings that there are still good people. Sure, she might have kept most of the money, but she could have kept all of the money and we would never have known. Years ago, I worked in a retirement community. Older man we knew was gay, developed a late-in-life relationship and moved into the community with his gay lover. He was a Korean vet, many honors, a wall of medals. He was also a bit of an asshole most days, but he had moments over a meal. His stories were fantastic. His children over 3 years never once visited him. He had a heart attack and knew he was going to die. His children showed up but demanded his lover leave for visits. In his will he leaves everything to his lover and his lover's one child from a former marriage. He wrote a long note about his kids' hypocrisy of not visiting, and their attitudes toward his lover. He left each of his 2 kids a pail of coal ash, to be deducted from his estate, had his estate paid for his lover's plot to be next to him and his wife, and in his long letter that his kids, if they visited him in his death, would be reminded of why they didn't visit while he was alive. It was, frankly, awesome hearing his kids blow up about it. When my grandparents on my mother's side were dying of cancer, my uncle, black sheep, piece of sheet of the family who I've never met, thank God, wanted to know what he was getting from the inheritance when they died. Not how's mom and dad or what can I do to help. My grandparents, being the people they were still going to give him an inheritance after all the faked up things he did to them, but my mother, the power of attorney, convinced them that they shouldn't be manipulated by him anymore. They ended up writing him an email back telling him that he wouldn't be included in the will anymore. He ended up threatening to burn their house down, my house down, killing me and my family etc. for betraying him, and you know what my grandparents did? They ended up including him in the will and sending him exactly 1 penny in check form by mail. That was the last time I have heard from him since. My will have something unusual. Story time. I sat my wife down to have the talk because I was getting ready to deploy to Iraq. This was during the incredible sectarian violence, and I wanted to make sure she knew everything to do in case I died. She's never serious, ever, but I wanted her to be serious for this discussion because it was damned important. I get through telling her all about it, and want to know if she has questions. Yeah, so. The life insurance, how does that work? She says, I don't really know, baby, what do you mean? She answered, well, did they just put the money in there? When? Look, she's not trying to be an asshole, right? It's not like she's just dying for the money. She wants to know the logistics of it. I'm sitting here thinking when she said, so do they put it in my bank account? Or do they give you one of those big checks when you win the lottery? As she holds her hands up like she's holding a huge check, laughter ensues. I have it written into the will that if I'm killed in action, I want the $400,000 to be given to her with a gigantic lottery check. Have a base photo, bring several folks over, shoot like the paparazzi as she stands on a stage, and do it, LOL. One of my former bosses was getting up in age and had no children. One day we were discussing family history and he mentioned how he still had the old family Bible his grandparents brought over from Germany, with the whole family tree handwritten into it, which I thought was an amazing thing to have. But he went on to lament that when he died it was going to have to go to his ungrateful, good-for-nothing niece since the old rules of inheritance said she should get it, even though he knew she didn't care a thing about the family history. Several of us involved in the discussion tried to convince him that there had to be some other family member that would give it the respect it deserved, or barring that, a historical society that would know what to do with it. But he would have none of it, since that just isn't the way it is done. Years later I thought of this while attending his funeral and tried to figure out who that niece was, maybe in hopes of broaching the subject with her, but never could. I still wonder about it sometimes and hope, for his sake, that it ends up in good hands. My parents have started their death cleanup. Those were my brother's words. Every time we visit they are asking us if there is something that they have that we want, and if so, for us to take it. They don't call it a death cleanup, but I have to applaud my little brother. That's what it feels like, and he called it on them. I'm willing to participate. I always say no. And my little brother is the most honest altruistic person you can ever meet, so he does too. But this Christmas I was in the garage with my dad and I saw this wooden model boat that I had never seen before. It was a beautiful painted 1.5-foot boat that my dad had made in carpentry class, or whatever you call it in English, when he was in school. The mast was broken. It had been somewhere at our summer house, as we say in Sweden, and I had never seen it. It was actually that house he grew up in, but that's a different story. At least as far as I can remember right now. My little brother helps out there a lot. I bet they stumbled across it and they saw it, and my little brother was as emotional about the thing as I was, since it had been something our dad made when he was younger than either of us. I understand if he said yes if my dad said why don't you take it. The point of my story is that I have a little brother that can't lie, has proven to be as altruistic as anyone comes, but for a second I turned into Sauron because of something my dad wanted to give him. A friend had 2 sisters when their father passed away. Their mother had died in their childhood. Anyway, years go by and the oldest daughter is the only one who keeps in contact with the father for various reasons. Dude was an abusive dick, played favorites, all of that shit. Older sister was obviously the favorite as she got everything. The other daughter and son, my friend, got $1 apiece. Oldest sister could have been told about it but decided to be bro status. They all sat down to dinner on a night and big sister was like, listen, dad left me all of this. It was a pretty sizable amount of money. She could have taken it and lived comfortably without working until the day she died. Maybe, definitely, if she manages the money properly. She sat down with her little brother and sister and was like 3 ways even. Deal, end of it. You all would think that you would do the same for your brother, sister, best friend, whatever. You'd be surprised what people are really like when money is involved, even a small amount of it. Fake up, not in this case though. This will probably get buried now, but I worked with trusts and estates for many years. One of my favorites was from a widower whose wife had died some 20 years earlier. After her death he wanted to travel the country in a motorhome but was too grieved to do so. Years later his old army buddy's wife died and they re-established their friendship in their retirement years. He finally bought the motorhome he dreamed of and left with his buddy to travel the continent, which they did for many years. After he passed away he left a new motorhome to his buddy, but with one stipulation. The buddy was required to mount a set of 6-foot longhorns on the hood of the rig before it would become his. It sounded like a Texan versus non-Texan dispute they'd had for many years. Absolutely brilliant, and seemed like an amazing friendship. I would have loved to hear their traveling adventures over the years. Readings aren't typical with wills, those are mostly a Hollywood thing. Still, sometimes the will specify a reading, usually, at least I've found, when the deceased wants to screw someone in front of the rest of the family. The strangest, and most embarrassing, reading was in a crowded room with relatives when a man who died fairly young, massive heart attack, early 50s, left absolutely everything to his 26-year-old stepdaughter, which was quite a lot of money and property. 2 ex-wives and children from the first marriage got nothing, nor did siblings, nieces, nephews, etc. The will specified that a DVD be played to explain why the stepdaughter was getting everything. Like everyone else I thought it'd be the guy explaining the big fake you to the rest of the family. What followed was completely unexpected. It was a hidden camera recording of the guy and his stepdaughter, at about age 15, having wild sesh, which they both were very clearly enjoying. The video starts in mid-coitus, with her screaming yes oh god yes. It had obviously been edited to start with maximum shock value, and it worked, because it took about 30 seconds for me to recover enough to turn the thing off. Definitely the biggest holy shit moment of my career. I later learned that the guy and his stepdaughter had been having sesh since she was 14, all the way to when he died, when she was 26. Apparently, though this is secondhand and I can't confirm, there were multiple clips of various video bits through the ages on the DVD. At the end of the DVD the guy explains that the stepdaughter gets everything because she'd been the best part of his life. Worst part, the will specified that I was to give every single family member their own copy of the DVD. The copies had been kept in a box and had been distributed prior to the showing, so everyone had the best moments of in their hands at the time the DVD was playing. Epilogue, the family sued and lost. Believe it or not, the girl got to keep everything. We had this old aunt who was despicable. She was full of evil and when I was young, and pretty much behaved perfectly. She once locked me in her bathroom for absolutely no faking reason at all. My family would search for me and she would pretend she didn't know where I am and it is one of the most horrific experiences of my life. My mother hated her and once fed her cat food telling her it was foie gras or some sheets. Anyways, she had a change of heart later on and she was pretty okay, gave me her gigantic Matchbox collection, and she will always give me lots of money. Let's say 20 euros when I was like 8 or 9, which I think is a lot for a 9-year-old that really only needs money to buy bubble gum. So having put that into context she said in her will X can have this, Y can have this, this goes to Z, as for the rest, kill yourselves to take them. It never dawned on me how fucking weird she was until now. Not a lawyer and wasn't alive when it went down, but it is verified fact. My great-grandfather died somewhat unexpectedly, and when it was read, he will state that everything was left to his grandson while his sons had use of the income for their lifetime. Now, he had 5 sons from 2 marriages, and at the time the will was written, had 8 grandchildren. My father was grandchild number 9 and was born several years after his grandfather's death. But, since the grandson wasn't named, he too was one of the heirs. Shockingly enough, the 5 sons were able to live out their lives without fighting over the estate. Then, even more surprisingly, the 9 grandchildren got together and broke the will so their mothers could have use of the income. All 5 women outlived their husbands, for their lifetimes. When the last of these women died, the 9 grandson again broke the will and had the estate distributed to the 8 grandsons still alive by then. The estate wasn't really that large, to be honest. Not life-changing or never have to work again levels. My father was able to retire a few years earlier than expected, but that's it. I grew up listening to the negotiations between the 9 as they guaranteed their mothers would have money to live on, etc. It was, I've been told since, a very rare occasion of that many people managing to overcome stupid/short-sighted will wording to come to amicable agreement. Not sure it really fits with Op's question, but there you go. There are a few points I'd like to mention about estate planning in this thread. First, most states/courts will not allow a spouse to leave absolutely nothing to the surviving spouse. An elective share prevents this. Second, most courts are very reluctant to enforce a will that completely disinherits, leaves nothing to, A child without sufficient evidence of the deceased's intent. For example, we have a very rich client with a child who's a drug addict. Client has tried many times to get this child clean, but nothing has worked. Client sets up a trust to pay for rehabilitation for this child after client dies. However, nothing else is left to this child. Everything goes to charity. To make sure of this, client comes into our office every 6 months to sign a confirmation of his intention to disinherit his child. Every 6 months he signs an affidavit in front of us saying I, client, wish to disinherit, child, entirely. I have provided other means for, child's, care, etc. Every 6 months is probably overkill, and we tell client this. Client insists on doing it this often just to be sure. It prevents the child from later claiming sure the client said that then, but we patch things up afterwards. It's heartbreaking to see someone so adamant about leaving nothing to their child. I can't imagine the pain that kid must have caused this parent. Client's estate plan will hold up in court, but many like it won't without adequate documentation. Third, it's possible in some states to have a more or less court certify a will before you die. I've worked on a number of premortem trust contests in which a client appears before a court which goes over and certifies his capacity and intent. Hopeful lawyer here, but I have a great story recounted by another lawyer in a paper I read. It's about this grandfather that turns 70 years old, and begins going deaf. By the time he's 74 is completely unable to hear. As this occurs his relatives spend time with him, and express their views that they either enjoy the time they spend with him, or hope that the miserable bastard dies already so they can inherit everything. They don't worry, as he's deaf and can't hear a damn thing they're saying. Anyway, he pulls on to his 80th birthday, blows out the candles on his cake, and stands up exclaiming he has been faking being deaf for the last decade. He then shames everyone who has spoken poorly of him, and says he will be going to be altered accordingly. The point of the story was that, while a cruel method, it worked extremely well to determine who you want to leave your assets to. I have to say, I've always found it extremely entertaining. When I was about 11 my great-grandmother died. She was my favorite person in the family. I remember her loving demeanor. She was my favorite person to spend time with in the family. She was also very wealthy, came from a Stanford-educated family that owned many companies and not many children to inherit. My family is also very awful and money-driven. They were waiting around for her to die. My family was very happy when she died because they got access to millions. They all fought over it, who got the lead diamonds, her house, and jewels etc. At 11 I refused to go to the funeral because they just went to pick through her stuff and it made me sad. All parts of the family came back from the funeral with moving trucks full of the stuff they wanted. I did ask for her recipe books. I never received them. My family brought me back the creepiest thing they could find in her house. An antique glass doll that looked like it was out of a horror movie and kept everything else for themselves. I look back and I am so glad I was able to recognize this at 11 years old. And I am glad that didn't get drawn into my family's awfulness. I am glad that I am the black sheep of the family, and that this was something that distanced myself from becoming anything like my family. And just in case anyone actually reads this and is wondering, yes, my family does have a lot of mental/personality disorders and I always distanced myself from them. I grew up and got away from my family and have nothing to do with them now. And in regards to my story, my family lost all of the inherited money due to poor decisions. My great-grandma is still my favorite person in my blood-related family. This won't ever be seen, but why not? So my father is the oldest of three, 2 brothers and 1 sister. When their father passed away 2 years ago it was discovered the will had been changed. The sister, my aunt, had convinced my grandpa to leave my father and my uncle nothing at all because she was a divorcee and had no job qualifications while her brothers were professionals. Why would my grandfather go for this? Because the edits were made while he was quite deep in his medical regimen for dementia. My uncle is a lawyer and is sure he has a case, but instead they're dropping it and have exiled my aunt. If she wanted the money so badly she would end her relationship with her brothers that she went on faking for 5 years while knowing she was screwing them over. That was what she'd deserve. A little bit of money and no one to share it with. She has no children and now no one in the pretty sizable family speaks to her. Hope she enjoys it. Mumble years ago my mother-in-law died. She had no will, but she did own a home and had a nice retirement and such from having worked for Ma Bell for 45 years. She had been a single mother for many years and had recently married a man she'd been keeping company with for a lot of years. She had invested some of her money in a home her husband owned, and then had his name put on everything else as she said she trusted him to do the right thing if and when the time came. She had 2 children, he had 1. In and of himself, I do believe she was right. He would have split her assets equitably. Why she didn't get it done by a lawyer, I have no idea except she hated any attorney. Okay, mother-in-law dies, we go for the funeral. The night she was buried, I'm sitting there asking her husband what he would like for dinner. He didn't answer. I asked again. His eyes rolled up and he slid off the couch onto the floor. Dead. EMTs came. He was gone. He doesn't have a will either. Another funeral to go. The day he's buried, it's decided to go through the house and decide what to do with personal belongings. We do. It all goes fine. Then, I had to push to get everyone together to meet with an attorney so everyone can decide what to do about probate, distributions, etc. The 3 kids all decide to use the same attorney. It's a very small town in the deep south. Law says that since she died first with no will, once probate is settled, all her assets go to him or his representative. In his case, her assets will go to his daughter along with all his assets since he survived her. Only things exempt were some IRAs she left in her children's names. I begged them to make an agreement at the attorney's office, signed it, and then they'd have it in writing. You see, the law in that state said anyone could contest the estates within a 6-month time period. After that, probate will kick in. They told me this is what they were going to do since after all, they knew each other, had been friends for years. And I didn't know how decent Southerners behaved? Really? I'm a Southerner too, just from a different part of the state. I begged, saying please be reasonable. Nope, I was ignored. Well, I think you know what happened. In 6 months, the daughter and her hubby took it all. Mom's kids wound up with nothing. No one said squat. My maternal grandfather passed away 11 years ago, leaving his home to his 4 children, with a lot of stipulations. My uncle never married and still lives there, and until he dies or decides to move out, no one gets a share. Another uncle owes the estate upwards of $50,000, and cannot receive a share until he first pays back the $50,000. The house is now worth around $700,000, but the $50K cannot be deducted from his share. Anyway, he had bone cancer and my mother and I lived with him and took care of him. I'd cook, clean, give massages, wipe his ass, etc. Until the day he died. He left my mother the contents of his bank account with the stipulation that she used it to pay off any remaining debt, hospital bills, of his, which she did, leaving her with nothing. This pissed off 2 of the other siblings and they still give her crap about it. She has rheumatoid, psoriatic and osteoarthritis. Sorry, not trying to turn this into a sob story, just getting to a point, but has to work full-time at Costco to barely make ends meet. He did have a hefty life insurance policy, but because she and I didn't want to attend church services because of the politics within the church, he left it all to the pastor and his children, and some to the church to build a new auditorium. While it did really hurt that he basically left us with nothing, he was a very, very good man. He was extremely generous with his time and money, a very hard worker, devoted, kind, etc. At the end of the day, he instilled some really great values in me, and I appreciate it so much I named my son after him. Unfortunately, he also left behind some bitter family members, causing tension in the family, and even caused the congregations at his church to split in half. I'm not completely sure what was going on in his head. Before my great-aunt passed away, my uncle, a lawyer, helped to draw up her will. He had assumed a lot of responsibility for her, although he couldn't visit her that often. His daughter would sometimes visit, but they were never on great terms. Our great-aunt favors my mother, and we will see her on the semi-regular basis. When she passed away, she left 1% of her will to myself and each of my sisters, but nothing to my mother. My mother was upset to have been forgotten despite the fact that they were on such good terms, but moved on. Strangely, she apparently left a full third of her inheritance to my uncle's daughter. It took us a while to realize that the names had been changed. The 1/3 of her estate had originally been for my mother, as the title had been for my niece, not great-niece. My uncle changed the will so his daughter would get the money instead of his sister. We never fought it, since our family is well off and we wanted to stay on good terms with everyone. But it was freeing to know that our great-aunt took care, but our douchebag uncle changed the will. A little long and late, but when my grandparents passed, their assets were to be split evenly between their children. Right after the funeral, all the children went to the farm to separate evenly. Unbeknownst to my aunt, my grandmother asked everyone what they wanted before she passed. She then had each child visit and take what they wanted. When my aunt arrived, she beamed for grandma's jewelry box. She tried to take everything. She even tried to keep the Rolex my parents had given my grandmother on her birthday, claiming it had significance to her, until my mother pointed out that it was engraved and wouldn't be worth much. My aunt then went around asking about key pieces my grandmother had given away and no one had seen them. But that's not the end. My grandparents owned a farm. Unfortunately, my grandfather had been a hoarder and there were acres of land cluttered with old tractors and antiques as well as just junk. I remember distinctly a garage made out of World War II ammunition boxes that housed a Model T in almost pristine condition. Anyway, my uncle was an executor and he decided that his daughter should live on the farm and clean it up. My grandmother passed in '93. My cousin is still living on the farm. They have sold off everything and my parents have never seen a cent. They can't sell the house because the land has not been cleared. My parents even went as far as finding someone who would clear the land for the price of the scrap metal so it wouldn't cost a dime. No dice, and because my grandparents stated in the will that my uncle would divide everything equally and as long as his daughter lives on the farm there is nothing we can do. Not a lawyer, but this is a crazy story that happened to my cousins. A mother, father, and their severely handicapped son died tragically together. The family was survived by their older son, who was married with a child of his own. The will stated that the entire estate should be given to the couple's 6 nieces and nephews, 3 from his side, 3 from her side, but excluded their surviving son, given that the mental state of the couple was extremely questionable. The 3 nieces and nephews from her side, my cousins, felt that the son's exclusion wasn't appropriate. The 3 from his side did not agree because they were greedy motherfakers. Long story short, there was a huge court battle and the son received his parents' estate. The cousins that were on his side also received a small share, while his greedy motherfaker cousins were buried in lawyer bills for nothing. It's actually pretty stupid for the cousins to try and fight it because the situation was a double suicide murder. They were very, very mentally ill.